KPFA Radio presents East Bay Yesterday. This series explores stories of culture, politics, and nature from Oakland, Berkeley, and other towns throughout Alameda and Contra Costa counties. Hosted by Liam O'Donoghue. Please enjoy this episode of East Bay Yesterday that previously aired live on KPFA Radio.
Hi, everybody. This is Liam O'Donoghue, and you're listening to East Bay Yesterday on KPFA 94.1 FM. We've got a ton of history to explore this hour, so I'm not going to spend very long on the intro. In segment 1, we'll be hearing about the history of Grizzly Bears in the East Bay. In segment 2, we'll be covering old-growth redwoods. And keeping with the nature theme, in the final segment, you'll be hearing a clip from my live event with Oakland-based author Jenny Odell. As always, to see photos related to these stories or to hear about my upcoming events, check out eastbayyesterday.com. Okay, let's jump right into the show. You're listening to East Bay Yesterday. This show is about history, but it's not stuck in the past. Let's begin. There are a lot of places in California that are named for things that were here, but aren't anymore. Where I'm standing right now is a perfect example. Grizzly Peak. It's one of the highest points in the East Bay. A few hundred years ago, you might have been able to look around and see dozens, maybe even hundreds of grizzly bears from up here. Now, the grizzly is on California's state flag, and you'll see bears all over Berkeley's campus, which is just downhill from here on the other side of Strawberry Canyon. But those are just images, of course. You'd have to go pretty far, like Yellowstone or Montana, to see the real thing. But speaking of Strawberry Canyon, that's the first place in the East Bay where Europeans reportedly killed a grizzly. Spanish soldiers shot one to death, right down there by the creek, back in 1772, according to a priest who was there. Less than 100 years later, in the 1860s, what was probably the last East Bay grizzly was gunned down in a San Leandro orchard. Sometimes when I'm up in these hills, I try to imagine what the East Bay used to look like. And that's not as easy as it sounds, because everything, plants, animals, even birds, they're so different now. Like, can you even picture a condor with a 10-foot wingspan flying above Tilden and then swooping down to pick at an elk carcass, sending a bunch of eagles scattering? Anyway, I do know one thing. Looking south from here, along the ridge, you'd be able to see some of the biggest trees that ever existed in the history of the planet. I'm talking about redwood trees that were thousands of years old and as tall as the Tribune Tower. Those old-growth redwoods, they're gone now too. They were wiped out at almost the exact same time as the grizzlies. When you think about it, it's kind of crazy how quickly everything changed. These things, grizzlies and redwoods, both so huge and powerful, such important parts of this landscape for millennia. Boom, practically gone in the blink of an eye. I honestly couldn't really wrap my head around how it all happened so fast. But I found a few people who helped me understand. And that's what this episode is about. It's about grizzlies and old-growth redwoods and what happened to them. And maybe that sounds a little depressing, but don't worry, because, history moves in cycles. The redwoods are already coming back. Maybe the grizzlies will someday, too. You're listening to East Bay Yesterday. I'm your host, Liam O'Donoghue. Stay tuned.
Oh, I just wish I had a time machine sometimes so I could go back and see, what the East Bay was with these large grizzlies roaming around and elk and pronghorn condors flying overhead. And I used to just daydream about it a lot.
That's the voice of Laura Cunningham, an East Bay native and one of my favorite artists. Looking at Laura's paintings is probably the next best thing to actually having a time machine. When she was a kid growing up in Kensington, a tiny little town in the hills just north of Berkeley, she tore up her parents' yard so she could replant it with native grasses. She even foraged the seeds. Ever since then, she's been obsessed with thinking about what California looked like before colonization. She studied paleontology and biology at UC Berkeley and worked all kinds of field study jobs for places like California's Department of Fish and Wildlife. And now she uses all the knowledge she's gained over the decades to paint these incredible scenes of, you know what, I'll just let her describe one of my favorites.
I was picturing hiking up along the bay shore, and this would specifically be up around El Cerrito, Albany, Richmond, kind of near the Golden Gate Fields racetrack. And there's just this beautiful area of mud flats. And I used to go there a lot in the 80s and look at all the shorebirds. So then I read an account of a beached whale in the 1860s, I think it was, in Monterey Bay. And the observer saw groups of grizzlies feeding on this whale and actually digging a hole with their claws into the whale's side and entering the innards of the whale and feeding on it from the inside out. I painted that on our East Bay shores. There's a giant gray whale that's beached and dead, and there's half a dozen or a dozen different colored grizzlies that have collected to the area, and they're feasting on this. They'll feast on this for weeks. And one of the grizzlies has scratched and bitten its way into the whale's side and is going inside the whale to feed on the organs. And there's a bald eagle here and there. Gulls are enjoying the scraps. So, yeah, this might have been an amazing scene that would happen once in a while in the Oakland shores.
What's this guy doing right here?
There's a big gray grizzly that just has a piece of whale flesh or whale blubber, and he's pawing at it and beginning to eat it. And the gulls are just circling around trying to get some scraps. So they've just opened up this newly beached whale, and they're beginning to drag out pieces of flesh and blubber.
And it looks like even the eagle is keeping a respectful distance, you know? No one wants to get in the way of the bears. They were kind of the top of the pecking order, so to speak. Huh?
Yeah, that's what I learned about in Yellowstone. Even our giant eagles, the bald eagle, had to wait its turn to get a scrap.
One swat from those big claws, and you wouldn't be doing too well.
You'd be gone.
Laura spent weeks in Yellowstone studying wild grizzlies and sketching them in their natural habitat. She's really dedicated to making sure her big paintings are as realistic as possible. When she wanted to recreate what the area around El Cerrito Plaza looked like centuries ago, she started by taking a picture and then working backwards from there.
So what I would do is I took the photograph and then I did research to try to paint exactly how the same scene looked, say, 500 years ago. So I'd walk around the El Cerrito Plaza area and look for remnants of were there oaks here, or maybe there's some purple needlegrass, native bunch grasses in this lot right there. And there were. You could actually find native plants around this neighborhood. So then I would do research about what the area looks like in the past. Of course, grizzlies were reported in historical accounts for this area. So the painting I did to match the photograph is basically a grassland with a single coast live oak looking out westward towards the bay, and there are California grizzlies dining on the fallen acorns of the oak.
If you want to see this image, it's in Laura's book, State of Change, Forgotten Landscapes of California. This book doesn't just show you what the East Bay used to look like, it helps you imagine what it must have been like to live here back then, too. I was curious if there was anything Laura learned from watching the bears in Yellowstone that surprised her.
I guess that they are just melding in their landscape. They can appear and disappear amongst hills and trees, and they just seemed like they covered huge amounts of ground. And it was also a little scary, too. Maybe I didn't realize how that hiking in Tilden Park, you don't think of it as scary at all. But with large 1,000-pound grizzlies roaming around, it must have been a different world. because they can just be hiding behind a coyote brush, and then you imagine walking by, and there they are, pretty quiet.
Of course, the native tribes that are now broadly referred to as Ohlone actually did live side by side with the grizzlies. Some reports say that bear claws were sacred objects used by shaman in ceremonies, but people still argue about this type of thing. It's hard to be certain about the relationship between the Ohlone and the bears because so much history was lost during the genocide of California's native peoples. But one thing's certain, Ohlone people and grizzlies coexisted for thousands of years.
Native Americans, from the accounts I've read, had a healthy respect, obviously, for bears. And I think there are some instances where grizzlies might have taken a life here and there, but there was an amazing lack of friction between the villages and native people here, and I haven't seen any evidence of like resource competition. I mean, that's the amazing thing about California in the past. It was just sheer abundance. So I never saw an account that said, oh, the Indians were having a hard time collecting acorns because they're all eaten by grizzlies. I never read anything or talked to any elders who remembered that. So it seems like there was plenty to go around.
This is pretty much what Karina Gould told me when I interviewed her for the episode about shell mounds, which are Ohlone sacred sites. Karina's a descendant of the Ohlone, specifically the Confederated villages of Lashon. She said that her ancestors gave the bears plenty of space, and the bears usually returned the favor. Although Spanish colonizers did write about seeing some indigenous people with nasty bear scars. Anyway, besides the danger of messing with bears, maybe the Ohlone also respected the fact that grizzlies had already been living in the Bay Area well before humans arrived on the scene.
I think the fossil evidence is that the Ursus arctos, that's the scientific name, that line of bears is basically a Eurasian line, and they came over the land bridge, Bering Land Bridge, in the Ice Age. Actually, I think pretty recently compared to some, like the black bear, which seemed to have a longer lineage in North America. So I think grizzlies are basically a Eurasian immigrant. And when they came, they just seemed to thrive. Being a grizzly in the East Bay must have been just a paradise. It must have been heaven. It was so easy compared to Yellowstone, which has harsh winters and pretty arid summers. But in the East Bay, and in fact most of coastal California, we had mild weather. Apparently some of the bigger male grizzlies never hibernated. They just didn't need to. There was plenty of food. So that may account why they got so large.
Depending on where they live, the average weight of an adult male grizzly currently ranges from about 400 to 800 pounds. California used to have grizzlies that were well over 1,000, maybe even 2,000 pounds. Some of the biggest might have stood around 9 feet tall. Besides all the salmon and trout and acorns, pretty much everything was on the menu.
Grizzlies ate just about anything. So they had these really long claws that were longer than our fingers that they used to dig up wild onion bulbs and roots and gophers. They'd dig up gophers and ground squirrels, and then they would turn over logs and stones to get beetle grubs. But they were also capable of running down a bull elk, a full-grown elk, and eating it, being a carnivorous predator.
Everything changed when the Europeans arrived. At first, it wasn't that bad. When most of the East Bay was owned by the Peraltas, the bears actually benefited from all the waste left behind by the family's ranches. The Peraltas were raising cattle to sell the leather hides and tallow, which was made from rendered fat. When they'd slaughter the cattle, they'd leave the meat and innards out in the fields. It was basically an all-you-can-eat buffet for the bears. Unfortunately, the men who were working in this growing cattle industry soon turned to the bears as a source of entertainment.
The gauchos, the horsemen, would go and literally 3 or 4 of them would lasso a grizzly. And so horses would be pulling at it from different angles so they could sort of control it. And they'd drag this poor beast into the corral and then get one of their magnificent fighting bulls and let him go and have a fight.
Sometimes tourists would even take steamships across the bay from San Francisco to see these bear versus bull fights go down in Oakland. Eventually, California outlawed the quote-unquote sport in 1854. Oh, and in case you were wondering, the bears were so much more brutal than the bulls that the gauchos usually had to handicap the grizzlies to make it a little more even.
I've read they tied a hind foot to a stake in the ground, and it seemed pretty unfair, but I guess grizzlies are so powerful, even a bull might just be thrown to the ground by one of these gigantic bears.
But it wasn't the Rancho Thunderdome that killed off grizzlies in California. It was the gold rush.
Yeah, I guess in the gold rush, 1840s and 50s, it seemed like meat of any kind was a needed commodity for the miners. So they had market hunters that actually would go all over the Central Valley and killing elk, pronghorn deer. I mean, it actually reduced the population of a lot of game animals in California. Grizzlies were part of the meat search to feed the gold rush, this influx of people.
That's right. So-called jerky hunters were prowling up and down the state, killing and jerkifying everything with four legs. But besides getting knocked down from the top of the food chain, the main problem for grizzlies was that California's new wave of settlers just really didn't want to live with them.
You know, you can imagine the Bay Area back in time with grassy flats and then oak woodlands here and there, and people were planting farms and having honey. And I've read accounts where the bears would come out of the hills and raid the hives that were used for farming and getting honey, or they'd come and raid a garden, for the vegetables. And even worse to people moving here were that they would go kill calves and cattle and sheep, and they were just too predatory on farm animals, raiding crops, and, very dangerous for people to, apparently for our culture, we just haven't designed a way to coexist with big predators. So that was, I think, something brought from Europe, that we cannot coexist, although other cultures can. So I think it was just shoot at sight, hire trappers, market hunters to trap the hills. And I think it was unfortunately pretty efficient.
It was pretty hard to take down grizzlies with the primitive guns they had back then. You could shoot a grizzly in the head and it would still come charging. So a lot of the extermination was done with poisons or other gruesome methods.
Yeah, really horrific giant metal bear traps were used in the past. They had to use some pretty heavy-duty things to get these. But that's the sad thing, is they did. They did successfully shoot and trap all the bears out of the state.
Before the gold rush, there were thousands of grizzlies in California. They were all gone from the East Bay within about 15 years and completely wiped out across the entire state by the 1920s. A few years ago, an environmental group called the Center for Biological Diversity announced a proposal to bring grizzly bears back to California. The logo of the campaign was pretty brilliant. It was the California state flag without the grizzly bear on it, because they said a blank flag is more realistic. The proposal didn't gain any traction with politicians, but it got a lot of media attention. And although some people were into the idea, a lot of people really, really weren't.
Hi, I just got back from a hike in the Sierra Nevada. This is an idea of putting grizzlies in national parks is the worst idea I have ever heard of. It's dangerous enough to be out there. Having grizzlies in national parks, what you're going to create is one extinct species, and that's the hiker.
That clip was a caller to KQED's public affairs show, Forum. Anyway, even Laura admits that trying to bring grizzlies back would be challenging.
I have two lines of thought about this, and my idealistic thought is, yes, God, I'd love to have just reintroduce wolves and grizzlies and expand the elk, instead of cattle. But then my other line of thought is kind of more down to earth and practical, and I just don't think it can happen with the culture we have that defines success by progress and development. I can't see reintroducing grizzlies, say, into a wilderness area in the Sierra Nevada and them not leaving. They'd want to go to areas that have richer resources like the Sacramento River or all those juicy farmlands. So I think you couldn't contain grizzlies in a mountainous, distant wilderness area. They would roam far and want to come to, say, the Bay Area where all the food resources used to be or are. So I think it's unfortunately impractical in California.
It may be impractical, but other animals like coyotes and otters have made a big comeback here. Wild wolves have even been spotted in Northern California a few times recently after being gone for decades. So who knows? If there's one thing we should understand about nature, it's that humans are not as in control as we'd like to think we are. But for the time being, the only place around here that you're likely to stumble on a bear is up in the Laurel district, where there are some really cool murals of grizzlies along MacArthur. I'll post photos of those on East Bay Yesterday social media. Oh, and Laura's next book might go back even further and show what the Bay Area looked like during the last ice age. That book would feature a bear that was even scarier than the grizzly.
This giant short-faced bear was a predator. It was like a meat eater. It was carnivorous, and it was gigantic. It was the largest North American land mammal predator ever.
Picture a bear that stood 12 feet tall, weighed a literal ton, and could run almost 40 miles an hour.
It had long cursorial limbs, meaning it could run like a horse. And since it was gigantic, it could probably just plow down a baby mammoth or a bison. And so a phenomenal Ice Age beast. I mean, we're almost maybe glad they're not around anymore.
Okay, so the grizzly bear is going to be one of the animals on the long-lost Oakland map. Coming up next, a story about one of the plants that will be on it. A few centuries ago, the Oakland hills weren't covered with trees like they are now. They were mostly pretty grassy. The exception was groves of old-growth redwoods. Some of these trees were probably over 350 feet tall. Just to put that in context, the Tribune Tower is only 305 feet tall. And there were two of Oakland's old redwoods that rose higher than all the rest. These trees are now known as the Blossom Rock navigation trees. Here's Amelia Sue Marshall, a longtime Oaklander, who just wrote a book called East Bay Hills, A Brief History.
What we call the navigation redwoods were described by a sea captain named Frederick Beechey. He was a Brit, and he came on the ship HMS Blossom to the San Francisco Bay in two subsequent Novembers of 1825 and 1826.
Frederick Beechey came here to map the bay, and one of his main goals was to create something called a hazard line, which is a line on a chart that captains can use to avoid hazards. In this case, the deadly obstacle he wanted to help people avoid was Blossom Rock.
Blossom Rock was a small island that is on the same undersea ridge as Alcatraz and a number of other rocks that have been subsequently blown up to prevent maritime collisions. So when Beechey wrote his sailing instructions, he described how you could line the hazard line up from the northernmost point of Yerba Buena Island, which is now the site of Treasure Island. You would line up that point with the two tallest tallest redwoods that could be seen on the ridge of the hills above the village of San Antonio, now Oakland. And he said that those two trees were too large and too separated from the rest of the redwood trees on the ridge to be overlooked. It was just a really obvious thing.
Blossom Rock was off the coast of San Francisco, pretty close to where Fisherman's Wharf is now. So the fact that these trees were easily visible from that far away is pretty impressive. But unfortunately for sea captains and future generations of Oaklanders, the navigation trees were chopped down sometime in the 1850s.
So after the trees were felled and the mariners had to use other means of avoiding Blossom Rock.
Until it was blown up with over 20 tons of explosives, that is.
Years went by, decades went by, and the naturalists in the East Bay Regional Park District and elsewhere said, where did those navigation trees stand?
Aha! A mystery. Proceed.
A forester for the East Bay Regional Park District named John Nichols undertook a very careful analysis using his knowledge of forestry, forest soils, tree regeneration rates, and also a geometric analysis. And based on the data that he was able to collect, he placed the site of the navigation redwoods at the Madrone Picnic Area in Redwood Regional Park.
There's a plaque there now commemorating the navigation trees. And something else interesting.
You'll notice along the crest of Redwood Peak, viewed from the south, that there are three crowns that stand way up, much taller than their neighbors, and they are placed in such a position that they definitely stick up over the hill, over the surrounding trees, and Nichols conjectures that those could be the successors, the genetically identical trees of the navigation progenitors.
And that's kind of a cool thought, that the original navigation redwoods have been chopped down, over 150 years ago, but they live on in this new generation that was sprouted with that identical genetic material. Something really nice about that.
It's a great thought that the tree is so willing to regenerate itself even against the sorts of insults that it experienced with the bullwhackers dragging away the lumber with their oxen down Park Boulevard, down Redwood Road, down 14th Avenue to Antonio Peralta's Embarcadero.
This is Liam O'Donoghue, and we'll be right back after this message from KPFA.
KPFA Radio is a community-powered, listener-supported radio station based in Berkeley, California. We are able to bring you this content through donations and support from our listeners. Please consider supporting KPFA through a donation by visiting www.kpfa.org/donate. And now let's get back to the program.
Welcome back to East Bay Yesterday. As far as we know, California's native people never chopped down a redwood tree. Even the Spanish didn't make much of a dent. The real problems began in the lead up to the gold rush.
Starting in the 1840s, we had people who would jump ships, Europeans who would jump ships. And our first major mill in the San Antonio Redwoods was the Palo Seco Mill, located on today's Palo Seco Creek, which is roughly at the bottom of Joaquin Miller Park. The Frenchmen didn't have any nails, and around 1842 they started building this mill, and they used wooden dowels, wooden pegs to hold the thing together.
Nails weren't the only thing these guys were missing. This was way before chainsaws, so they used tools that were practically medieval to take down these giants.
The early techniques for logging involved building platforms where the loggers would stand around the trunk of the tree and hack away at it. They would use crosscut saws. They would use a device called a jack screw to pop the felled tree onto a cart to be hauled away. They used ox carts, and the stories of the rugged bullwhackers who felled the trees and were well fueled by alcohol and definitely a surly bunch are legendary.
If this sounds like back-breakingly hard work, it was. But these guys were beasts. They were up in the hills eating barbecued snakes. Seriously. And when they came down from the canyons, it was usually bad news.
Livestock rustling during the 1850s was so common a practice that the boys from the Redwoods would ride down to what's today's downtown Oakland in pursuit of rustlers. And at least on one or two occasions, they lynched and hung fellows who had been involved in livestock rustling.
An East Bay park ranger later described the logging camps as, quote, a suburb of hell. Keep in mind that most of these early loggers had absolutely no right to cut down the redwoods. At least for the first few years, none of those guys owned the property they were logging on. At one point, Antonio Peralta got 20 soldiers to ride up from the Presidio in San Jose to evict a bunch of lumber poachers. But after the Mexican-American War, there was no cavalry left to protect these trees that had stood since the time of the Roman Empire. Again, Amelia Sue Marshall.
There was a heavy layer of racism involved here. In 1848, there was war between the Californios and the incoming Yankees that was resolved with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. That opened up the floodgates for the gold rush. California was seen as a tremendous repository of timber resources, of mining resources, of fishing resources, of land for settlement. And the fact that there was a system of Spanish law that allowed legal title to the rancheros, most of whom had served with distinction for the King of Spain and later the government of Mexico. And they were being rewarded because they weren't being paid in money and they weren't being compensated in any way that we would recognize. It was pretty much a barter economy. They were rewarded for a lifetime of service with a land grant. And the U.S. courts subsequently affirmed those land grants. But the immigrants who came and disregarded the ownership rights of the Latinos, the Californios, because they felt that Mexico had lost the war against the United States and therefore there were no rights. The land was there for the taking by the white Americans.
Nobody knows exactly how many redwoods were here at the time of the gold rush, but the groves might have gone all the way out to Moraga, so there were a lot. California officially became a state in 1850. After that, the ancient trees were practically all gone within a decade.
There was quite a boomtown atmosphere in the 1850s when all the logging was going on and the 9 or 10 mills were in operation. Once the steam technology came in, that allowed them to go through lumber at a much more rapid pace than was the case prior to the steam engine being introduced there on the creeks. They could saw it faster. They could send the lumber down in carts. It was much more efficient than dragging a giant redwood trunk by ox cart down rough roads.
Those rough roads, they're another legacy of these Wild West sawmills. The routes that were used for dragging lumber are still some of the main arteries of the Oakland Hills. Thornhill Road, Shepherd Canyon, Redwood Road, even 35th Avenue.
Well, they took their easiest gradient. They were using livestock to haul lumber, and where they could, they would follow a creek channel, like Park Boulevard follows the Saucil Creek channel. and they would just take the easiest way to get down. It may have been a trail that indigenous people had been using for centuries, and they just expanded on those trails.
Remember how at the beginning of this episode I said that it's hard to picture what the East Bay used to look like because everything is so different now? This is what I'm talking about. I used to think that the forests up in places like Redwood Regional and Joaquin Miller Parks were, natural, but that's not really the case.
Around 1910, 1920, we had an influx of real estate developers. Their objective was to sell as many lots for houses as they possibly could. In order to make the hills more attractive, they wanted to plant trees.
The logging operations had left the hills looking pretty devastated. And for the real estate people who now owned this land, they just wanted their property to look nicer.
These guys were planting Monterey pine, Monterey cypress, acacia, and, of course, eucalyptus.
None of these species are native to the East Bay. But you know what? When I'm hiking around in the Oakland Hills on a hot, sunny day, I'm glad they're there, keeping it shady. Oh, and one last thing. Even though everybody thought all the old-growth redwoods had been chopped down, there's actually one left. It was discovered in 1969 by a local naturalist named Paul Covell.
Covell discovered what we call Old Survivor or Grandpa Redwood in the Leona Heights area, in the fairly wild city of Oakland, Leona Park, which encompasses an old mining area. It's directly downslope from Merritt College campus. It's not easy to get to. I personally have not been able to climb up there. I would require climbing ropes, and you have to be pretty strong and agile to get to it. That's how it survived. It's just in an unlikely location, but it's easy to see from Karl Monk's school.
Old Survivor is probably about 500 years old, meaning that it could live for another millennium. That's enough time to watch the relatively young trees up in the Oakland Hills now develop into the next wave of massive old-growth redwoods. And maybe someday, grizzly bears will even roam among them, and condors will build nests in their towering canopies once again. All right, you are listening to East Bay Yesterday on KPFA Radio. I'm your host, Liam O'Donoghue. That last segment was part of my Long Lost Oakland miniseries. If you want to check out the Long Lost Oakland map and find out where you can get a copy or hear more episodes from that miniseries, check out my website, eastbayyesterday.com. Coming up next is a segment from my event at Wolfman Bookstore in downtown Oakland with Oakland-based author Jenny Odell. Jenny's new book is called How to Do Nothing, and it's been getting a lot of attention. You're about to find out why. Let's jump right into it. Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I'm Liam from East Bay Yesterday. So we're here tonight to talk about Jenny Odell's new book, How to Do Nothing, Resisting the Attention Economy. And this book is so necessary right now. Here's an example of why. I couldn't stop myself from checking Twitter like every 15 minutes when I was trying to force myself to write down and sit down and write this introduction. And it's not just like for the obvious reason that this book is important, that apps are sucking our attention spans and destroying them, but because, as you warn us in the book, if you're ever in a disaster, those who help you will likely not be your Twitter followers, but your neighbors. So as those of you who have already read it know, this book isn't nihilistic or fatalistic as the title might imply. Jenny frames doing nothing not as a cop-out, but as a way to clear space and focus on what's really important. This book's focus on reprioritizing local connections to nature, to our neighbors, and to our own inner selves is why I wanted to call this event How to Do Nothing in Oakland, because Jenny's insights on how to challenge the forces that are disconnecting us from nature and from each other and from ourselves. A lot of those insights in the book emerged from this place, from Oakland. Jenny challenges the placelessness that's becoming ever more ubiquitous in our so-called digital world. She writes, I want to argue for a new placefulness that yields sensitivity and responsibility to the historical and the ecological. Building or rebuilding those connections with our past and with our natural world shouldn't be considered a whim or a privilege or a luxury. As we'll discuss tonight, this awareness and care is a matter of survival. Less than 200 years ago, Oakland and the Oakland Hills were home to thousands of old-growth redwood trees, some of the biggest the world has ever seen, some that were even taller than the Tribune Tower right across the street from us right now. And all those trees were cut down during the gold rush, except one. Writing about Oakland's last remaining old-growth redwood tree, Jenny says, surely as the needles that grow from old survivor are connected to its ancient roots, the present grows out of the past. This rootedness is something we desperately need when we find ourselves awash in an amnesiac present and the chain store aesthetic of the virtual. Oakland has a long tradition of radical thinkers, and Jenny, I think, is helping to keep that tradition alive. This book challenges a capitalistic culture that dictates not just what we do, but how we think. It challenges a culture of capitalism that dictates not just what businesses or kinds of homes are in our city, but every aspect of the ecology and the geography around us. And although Jenny is quick to say this isn't really a self-help book, it does offer some answers as well as presenting these challenges. The introduction to the book states that awareness is the seed of responsibility. Of course, what that implies is that action must follow awareness. While trying to understand the place that she grew up, Jenny visited a creek near her childhood home. And for those of you who might need a little motivation to break out of your normal routine and look at the world a little differently, I'd like to share one more passage from the book before we start the conversation. Jenny writes, snaking through the midst of the banal every day is a deep weirdness, a world of flowerings, decompositions, and seepages, of a million crawling things, of spores and lacy fungal filaments, of minerals reacting and things being eaten away, all just on the other side of a chain link fence. So if that doesn't inspire you to go out and explore, I don't know what will. Ladies and gentlemen of Wolfman Books, please give a warm welcome to Jenny Odell. All right. So in the book, you say that you ask, I should say, what does it mean to construct digital worlds when the actual world around us is crumbling right before our eyes? And I was wondering if you were inspired to write that by all the potholes in Oakland.
Oh my God, we have really, really bad potholes on my street.
It's literally crumbling.
Yeah, I wasn't directly inspired by that, but I talk about growing up in more kind of the San Jose area, and I work at Stanford now, so I've always been kind of struck by this juxtaposition of these companies that are putting out products that are contributing to a sense of placelessness, and then you kind of turn and look and there's the Santa Cruz Mountains, and it's, I don't know, being kind of caught in between those two types of realities kind of influence that. And now also potholes will remind you of that.
So something that a lot of the reviews have mentioned, and congratulations on all the positive reviews that the book has been getting. Something that a lot of them have mentioned is that you were inspired, as you write in the introduction to the book, it was the fall of 2016, President Trump had just been elected, and a more local tragedy, of course, was the ghost ship fire. And at the time, you were just feeling devastated, emotionally drained, confused, sad, anxious, and that you had been booked to give a speech at a conference, a keynote address, and you didn't know what it was going to be about, so you just sat down and wrote how to do nothing on your computer and then walked across or around the block to the Rose Garden in your neighborhood, the Morecambe Rose Garden over by Lake Merritt in Oakland. And so I'm wondering, what is it about that specific place that inspired the philosophy that you put forth in the book?
So I don't know how many of you have been to the Morecambe Rose Garden, but it's off of Grand, and so if you've been there, you know that it's really, really beautiful. And for me, I think it's had to do with how often I go there. So it's almost like, it feels almost not my front yard, but it's a 5-minute walk. So it's easy for me to get to, and it's sort of, there's places like Yosemite, right, where you go there to be in awe of nature, and it's amazing, and then you leave and you're like, I'm not there anymore. I'm just in the sort of like fallen every day. And I think I really like places that are kind of somewhere in between, where it still feels continuous with the rest of your day. Obviously it feels different, but it's this kind of place where you can easily go to drop out of this forward-pressing, productive time, even if that's only 15 or 20 minutes. You know what I mean? It's like more kind of woven in with my everyday. So I think it was like it's sort of a deep familiarity with the space and comfort. Like I get a lot of comfort from being there. I feel like I know the inhabitants fairly well, human and non-human. I know a lot of the gardeners there now. They made sure the fountain was turned on when they took the photo for the New York Times review. So because they knew, they were like, do you have a photo shoot today? And they were like, made sure the fountain was turned on. And, Grayson the cat and the turkeys and all the different birds. So it's kind of like a space of, obviously it's a park, so it encourages a certain type of being. It doesn't demand a lot from you, but it's also that feeling of familiarity. It provided the opportunity for me to think about why I feel like viscerally so different when I sit there versus kind of, at that time especially, the rest of my day.
I'm really glad in the book when you describe the park, you specify that it's a public park, and that the origins of it are that it was a WPA era project created during the Great Depression to create beauty in Oakland and also to help put people back to work, and that it's a public space. And it made me think of the contrast between these things in San Francisco that are all over the place now called POPOs, which stands for Privately Owned Public Open Space. I used to work in downtown San Francisco, and I would eat lunch in the Popos, and they're terrible. I mean, there's like security guards, there's cameras, there's not much nature, the statues are usually really ugly. And so I'm just wondering if you can talk about that contrast between real public spaces and these kind of quasi-public spaces that are sort of masquerading as parks but are not parks, in terms of like the thought that they inspire when you're there.
Right. So when I originally gave How to Do Nothing as a talk at that conference, I have a slide with an image of one of those popos. They always have like metal chairs, and it's also usually like very ambiguous. Like, yes, it's public, but they kind of make it look like it's not. So you're like, I'm not really sure. Or there's also some interesting instances where some of the chairs belong to a business and some of them don't, and you're just kind of supposed to know like which ones are which. So I guess they're technically public spaces, but I prize the Rose Garden as like a very obviously public space where you're not required to do anything to be there. So you don't need to pretend to be thinking about eventually buying something. You don't need to. I mean, there's literally no limit to the amount of time you can be there. I've been there all day before, even architecturally, it's sort of designed where, there's so many different places you could sit and ways that you could walk through. It's a very inviting space. And that doesn't make these sort of demands on you. So I draw that distinction like in the chapter between faux public spaces, not just like popos, but like places that are clearly not public spaces that take on the attributes of a public space. So I talk about Universal Studios City Walk. I don't know if anyone's known City Walk. Yeah. So it's basically a theme. It's an extension of a theme park, but it has a kind of artificial architectural diversity. Of course, you're just supposed to shop. And if you don't shop and behave in the way that you're supposed to, it's very easy to police that. Yeah.
A minute ago, you mentioned the kind of labyrinthine nature of the Rose Garden, and another sort of labyrinthine structure in Oakland that you mentioned in the original talk. I don't think it's in the book, but I think in the How to Do Nothing presentation was the Chapel of the Chimes over at the end of Piedmont Avenue that Julia Morgan designed, columbarium full of urns and ashes. And in the book, you talk about how it's you appreciate the fact that it's maze-like and that there's no maps that say, like, you are here. So it's almost like inviting you to get lost in it. What is it about sort of like wandering around in this semi-lost state that you find inspiring creatively?
I will just say, like, to that point about the map, I don't know if anyone here has noticed this, but if you go to the Chapel of the Chimes, there is a map that is highly detailed because, you know, there's all those little rooms, but it doesn't say you are here. So when you look at it, you're like, yes, I am in a very complex space, but you have, like, no idea where you are.
It's like an M.C. Escher painting in some of the walls.
Totally, yeah. And then the way that, you know, there's different levels, so it's very, I mean, I'm amazed. I go there all the time, and I still feel like I occasionally will find a new room.
Yeah,
I mean, that's
totally.
been like years, and I go there a lot. So anyway, I just like aesthetically am fascinated with the idea of a space that's not technically very big, but that you can walk a long distance through because of the way that it's designed. So it's not walking through a space and it's not standing still in a space. It's like something in between those two. And I also think that wandering, I mean, I also, you know, frequently after going there, we'll go to the cemetery because it's right next door. And there's also similarly no obvious way to walk through that cemetery. And if you are so lucky to have, you know, an hour or so there and you're not in a hurry, I'm fascinated with, like, why you take the routes that you do. It's kind of this feels like free will. I don't know, right? Like, you're kind of like, I'm going to go this way just because I feel like it, you know, like, when do you get to have that feeling, like, ever? And so I go there with, like, you know, on different days, like, oh, I want to go see if there are any night herons in the pond or see if, like, the tulip tree is flowering yet or, but it feels like this very undirected from outside kind of activity where it's just proceeding from, like, pure, just, like, I feel like it or I have an instinct to go in this direction.
Yeah, no, I know what you're talking about. I feel the same way in terms of going to the same spaces over and over again, but still finding new ways to explore them. When I'm up in the Oakland Hills exploring, you know, Redwood Regional Park, Joaquin Miller Park, Sibley, these places that I've been going to for years, super frequently, but occasionally I'll still stumble across a trail I've never noticed before, like a no-name trail or some kind of side trail, and it's, like, invigorating to be like, ooh, here's a new one, let's see where it goes.
Yeah, I think just being surprised is a really important feeling. I think I'm constantly seeking out that feeling, and I love, that kind of the feeling of turning a corner and seeing, like, a new side trail or something like that. It's just a great feeling. Yeah.
So speaking of the Oakland Hills, one of the Oakland landmarks that you mentioned in the book is Old Survivor, Oakland's oldest tree, as I mentioned in the little prologue there, the last remaining redwood tree in Oakland. And I'm wondering if you can share, for the people who haven't read the book yet, the little metaphor that you create when you compare, you know what I'm talking about. And then also, just if you can talk a little bit about how you came up with that comparison. 'Cause it seems like the type of thing that would have struck you when you're in nature. And I'm just wondering, you know, if a lot of those thoughts that came to you in the book happened when you were just exploring the nature of Oakland and the wider Bay Area.
Yeah. So, in the introduction, I compare Old Survivor to a tree from a Taoist story called The Useless Tree, or that's how it's sometimes translated. And that story is about a carpenter who sees a very large, impressively large gnarled oak tree, and is sort of like disdainful about it, like, oh, it only got to be that size because it's useless because of its shape to me as a carpenter. So it's not a good timber tree. And then he goes to sleep and the tree shows up in a dream and basically says, who are you to call me useless? You don't even know what useful is, and you're a mortal man and you will die. It's this kind of like joke about like useful for what, which is like a question I keep coming back to in the book. Is like, okay, productivity, productive of what and for whom and why? There's a detail that I actually only noticed on the second reading of the story, that the tree was so large that it shaded several thousand teams of oxen. So it's a really big tree, and it's extremely useful. It's like it's taking care of all of these living beings, right? And so it's basically a story about this narrow idea of usefulness, that if you are a carpenter who only sees planks, then yes, like this tree will look useless to you. And one of the things that the tree says in the story is uselessness has been very useful for me because it's allowed the tree to escape being cut down. And similarly, Old Survivor, the actual tree in Oakland, was it's weirdly shaped as well, and it wasn't big compared to other redwood trees, and it's also in kind of an odd location. It's kind of hard to get to, so it was similarly spared by its uselessness.
Yeah, I love that comparison. So the book's not just about nature. It's also about kind of affirming or reaffirming our humanity and our care for ourselves and each other. And one of the places that in Oakland that you do that you mentioned in the book is on AC Transit. So I'm just wondering if you can talk about, you described like taking the bus from your apartment to your studio. And I'm just wondering if you can speak to the usefulness of public transportation as more than just a place from going from point A to point B.
Yeah. So I'm very lucky to live on the 12 line, which goes right to my studio by Jack London Square. And I feel like I've always been very into taking the bus. Like, I pride myself on knowing where all the bus lines go. And for me, I talk about it in the book as kind of one of the last spaces where we're thrown together with strangers that we have no instrumental reason to be around. It's in a chapter called Ecology of Strangers, which that's the whole argument of that chapter, is that you should pay attention to people and creatures that you have no obvious reason to be paying attention to. And so it's this kind of, an opportunity to sit in a space with others who are going, and to consider every person here is going somewhere for some reason, and you have to kind of just sit with that and sit with the reality of other people outside of your kind of sphere of whatever. I mean, I think there's been a lot that's been written and said about the filter bubble online, but I think there's almost like a bigger filter bubble around that, or like a filter bubble mentality that is encouraged by things, like algorithmic recommendations to you, where you kind of get into this mindset where you're like, I'm only going to pay attention to the things that will help me gain something, or that I have some obvious reason to be into. And then you kind of start to filter out everything and everyone that isn't part of that. And so just sitting on the bus, not just on the bus, you sit on the bus and you look at, it's slow. So you have a long time to kind of consider everyone walking down the street. And it's just, for me, it's an important reminder of the reality of other people's realities.
Yeah, no, totally. And then getting back to this issue of public space versus private space, hearing you describe that scenario reminds me of the situation where, I think it was a year or two ago, there was some startup that was basically we have this revolutionary idea. It's going to be this mode of transportation that drives around the city in a certain route and picks some people up and drops some people off. And we're going to, and people were tweeting at them it's a bus. You just reinvented a bus. They already exist everywhere. Except they're public goods, not, something that people are going to try to milk as much cash as possible out of.
Yeah, and that also kind of gets at, you heard me say this earlier at Heyday, but I think a lot about in the kind of rhetoric of disrupting, there's often this kind of implication of replacement, there's some stuff here and I'm just gonna clear it away and I'm gonna make this brand new thing and it's gonna be perfectly designed from the beginning, so it'll just be perfect forever. Whereas so a lot of what I'm advocating for in this book is a version of progress that is more observant and more based around listening to what and who is already there, that could use care and attention. And so to me it's just so emblematic, right? I invented the bus. It's there is something already here that needs support. It's the same thing with libraries too. There was the famous debacle last year where a guy wrote a column for Forbes that was basically saying, why do we need libraries when we have Amazon? You don't have to answer that. So one of my favorite concepts from the book is, as you put it, looking at reality rather than through it. Okay, sorry we had to fade that out, but we've run out of time on this hour. This has been East Bay Yesterday, and I've been your host, Liam O'Donoghue.
For 75 years, KPFA's mission has been clear: to provide an independent platform that is truly of the people, by the people, and for the people. Of the people, our airwaves truly belongs to you. For the people, everyone deserves access to diverse and unfiltered news and information. By the people, our funding comes from people who value the importance of independent media. Support us today at kpfa.org. For 75 years, KPFA has presented progressive voices who spoke truth to power. Patty Hearst.
On February 7th, a white envelope with a fictitious Berkeley return address was delivered in the morning mail to KPFA.
For the first time since her kidnapping came the voice of Patricia Hearst herself.
Mom, Dad, I'm okay. I had a few scrapes and stuff, but they've washed them up and they're getting okay, and I've caught a cold, but they're giving me pills for it, and so I'm not being starved or beaten or unnecessarily frightened. I've heard some press reports, and so I know that Steve and all the neighbors are okay, and that no one was really hurt.
94.1 FM, a beacon of independent thought and community engagement. 75 years of building community trust. Support us today at kpfa.org.
You've been listening to East Bay Yesterday. You can find us online at eastbayyesterday.com or at the East Bay Yesterday Substack or East Bay Yesterday Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram.
I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If you want to find more KPFA radio content, log on to www.kpfa.org. Also follow us on social media by visiting Facebook at KPFA 94.1 and Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at KPFA Radio. Plus, check out our KPFA TV video content on YouTube and twitch.tv at KPFA Radio. Subscribe to this podcast and stay updated to when we release episodes of shows representing the best of KPFA Radio.